In order to convince people of the miracle and validity of his prophethood, Muhammad used poetry as a method of his conviction. In his day, poetry was in vogue and was marveled by the people as the highest form of literary beauty. This is the reason why the language of the Quran is written in a rhymed prose, composed of both poetry and prose. Professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies Irfan Shahid, in The Surah of the Poets, within the abstract writes, quote, Islam and poetry is a major theme in the study of Islamic religion and civilization. The struggle between the two began during the lifetime of the Prophet in the early Meccan period of the call, and more importantly is reflected in the Quran itself in Surah 26, titled The Surah of the Poets, hereafter. Unquote. The chapter that the professor is referring to is chapter 26 called Shu'ara, meaning poets. It was revealed because the disbelievers of Mecca were in constant refusal to acknowledge the message of Muhammad, stating that he did not provide enough evidence to support his claim to prophethood. They were not convinced by the so-called miracle speech of the Quran. Instead, they marked him as another poet, but not as good as them. They mocked his message and disparaged his mission. Therefore, it is not true, as claimed by Muslims, that the early Arabs accepted Islam due to the beauty of the Quran. Even within Hadith literature, the early Arabs equated Quran recitation to reciting poetry. For example, in Sunan Nasai 1006, it was narrated from Abdullah that a man came to him and said, Last night I recited Al-Mufassal in one rak'ah. He said, that is like reciting poetry. But the Messenger of Allah used to recite similar surahs, 20 surahs from Al-Mufassal, those that start with Hamim. Professor of Islamic Studies who teaches Arabic literature at Harvard University, Professor Nasir, believes the Quran follows a metric system that matches Arabic poetry. The link is in the description. This is because the Quranic language is indeed based upon a science called al-urud, which is the study of poetic meters. It identifies the meter of a poem and determines whether the meter is sound or broken in the lines of the poem. It is often called the science of poetry in Mushaf. The Encyclopedia Britannica under Islam, page 6 says, quote, Thus the Quran often gives the impression of having been produced by a rather haphazard method of composition, an impression that is further heightened by the fact that certain phrases such as but God is forgiving, compassionate, God is knowing, wise, most of them know nothing, often have little or no apparent connection with the immediate context. In fact, some skeptics claim that these additions served only to produce a needed rhyme. The Quran was dismissed as a poor imitation of poetry and ancient fables regurgitated. There was no miracle attached to it when Muhammad first started preaching. It says in Quran 6:25, people used to say, this is not but fairy stories of the ancient. The Quran goes on to distance itself from poetry in numerous places. For example, it says in Quran 36:69, and we did not teach him knowledge of poetry, nor is it befitting for him. It is not but a message and a clear Quran. Quran 69:41 says, and it is not the word of a poet, little do you believe. As the poets were the ones who ridiculed the Quran and its style of recitation, it condemns poets in Quran 26 verses 221 to 226 saying, "And as to the poets, those who go astray follow them." It likens their speech to deliberate ambiguity only followed by the misguided, astray, perverse, and deviators. The major threat to his convincing that the Quranic message was divine were the poets, who were able to see through the deception and ruse. Muhammad felt threatened by poets, and he got rid of them, all of whom mocked him by claiming that their own poetry was better than Muhammad's Quran, and that his revelation was only of old fables which he had copied, alluded to in Quran 8:31. Quote, "And when our verses are recited to them, they say, 'We have heard. If we willed, we could say something like this. This is not but legends of the former peoples.'" End quote. Here are the list of poets Muhammad ordered the killings for the crime of mocking him. Despite ordering killings of these poets for mockery, Muhammad used his own poets to mock people. It says in Sahih Bukhari 4124, Al-Bara bin Azib said, on the day of Qurayza siege, Allah's Messenger said to Hassan bin Thabit, "Abuse them with your poems, and Jibreel is with you." To try and set itself as distinct from mere poetry, the Hadith literature also distances the Quran from accusations of poetry. For example, in Sahih al-Bukhari 6154, narrated Ibn Umar, the Prophet said, "It is better for a man to fill the inside of his body with pus than to fill it with poetry." In Sunan Ibn Majah 749, it was narrated for Amr bin Shuhaib from his father that his grandfather said, "The Messenger of Allah forbade buying and selling in the mosque and reciting poetry in the mosque." As is commonly the case, the Hadith literature often contradict. The example here is in Sahih Bukhari 3212, where Muhammad allowed poetry to be recited in the mosque. Why the Quran came to be written in a poetic language is because poetry held an important position within pre-Islamic society. It was the poet who filled the role of the historian, soothsayer, and propagandist. The poet represented an individual tribe's prestige and importance in the Arabian Peninsula. They were powerful, as the praise of a tribe or denigrating other tribes were the most popular forms of early poetry. They had the ability to stir emotions, lead people into battle, or denigrate a person, attributes that the Quran took over. Ukaz, a market town not far from Mecca, would play host to a regular poetry festival where the craft of the poet would be exhibited. Alongside the poet, there would often be an apprentice called Rawi, or narrator. The job of the narrator was to learn the poems by heart and to recite them with explanations, with a beautiful or dramatic voice, and often with embellishments. They would also have to be able to mention the chain or isnad of people from whom they learnt the poem. This tradition allowed the transmission of these poetic works and the practice which was later adopted by the Huffaz or Qurra for their memorization and recitation of the Quran, and Rawi for Hadith preservation. A well-known tradition prior to Islam was al-mu'allaqat, which literally means the hanging, referring to the poems that were hung on the Kaaba, or perhaps because they are like precious jewels that are hung and watched. Nonetheless, they were considered the best of pre-Islamic poems. Coincidentally, just like the Ahraf and Qira'at explained in Part 6, in some accounts it is the 7 poets, in others it is the 10 poets. Here are the names of these poets who were most famous and had influenced Muhammad. Pictured here is a book called Al-Mu'allaqat al-Ashr, the 10 Al-Mu'allaqat, written in Arabic. It contains some of their poems and a brief biography of the poets. Islamic tradition says Muhammad admired some of these poets and that their poetry even had some sort of a divine message. For example, in Ash-Shama'il al-Muhammadiyah 247, Abu Huraira said, as the Prophet said, the most poetic saying spoken by the Arabs is the saying of Labid, everything but Allah is surely futile. In Sahih Muslim 2256, Abu Huraira reported, I heard Allah's Messenger saying, the truest word which the poet stated is the word of Labid. Behold, apart from Allah, everything is in vain. Also, Muhammad was accused of taking pre-Islamic poetry and including it directly into his revelation, the Quran. These are from the works of earlier poets such as Tarafa, and a famous example was that of the works of Ibn al-Qais is found verbatim in the Quran. Within numerous Islamic sources, books such as Faid al-Kabir by Muhammad Abdullah Manawi, Volume 2, page 187, details how Qais' poetry and its similarity to Quranic verses. A tradition is mentioned in Lughat al-Sha'ira, language of the poets, by Abbas Mahmud Akkad, albeit seeking to distance itself from the incident. It mentions, quote, that one occasion Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad, was reading the verse, the hour has drawn near and the moon was split in two, Quran 54:1. The daughter of Ibn Qais heard it and said to her, this is a piece from my father's poetry which your father took. In other versions, it is Ibn Qais' granddaughter. Nonetheless, Muslims do not deny such poetry exists. Referenced in Islam the Honest Truth, others such as Dr. Ayman, writing in Language Barrier, offers the theory that the poems were actually written after the time of Muhammad and back projected to the pre-Islamic period. However, to this day, Ibn al-Qais remains the best known of the pre-Islamic poets and has been a source of literary and national inspiration for Arab intellectuals into the 21st century. In his entry in the Dictionary of Literary Biography, Volume 311, Tahir Ahmed Makki says about him on page 212, the Prince poet Ibn al-Qais of the tribe of Kinda is the first major Arabic literary figure. Verses from his Al-Mu'allaqah, one of the 7 poems prized above all others by pre-Islamic Arabs, are still in the 20th century the most famous and possibly the most cited lines in all of Arabic literature. The Mu'allaqah is also an integral part of the linguistic, poetic, and cultural education of all Arabic speakers. As an illustration of plagiarism, in this slide, highlighted in red boxes, is the exact same wording from Ibn al-Qais' poetry found in the Quran. For more information on plagiarism, please refer to Islam the Honest Truth, which also details the classical commentaries for these verses, including Quran chapter 99. It should not come as a surprise, because despite outwardly criticizing poetry, Muhammad kept himself surrounded by poets and admired it. After all, poetry was an important part of Arabian culture at the time, so he fraternized with poets. From them, there were 3 well-known poets he was especially close to. These were Number 1, Hassan ibn Thabit, who was the best known for his poems in defense of Muhammad. He is also regarded as Islam's first religious poet, who used phrases from the Quran in his poetry and was instrumental in spreading the message of Muhammad. Number 2, Abdullah ibn Rawah was Muhammad's scribe as well as his personal poet. Number 3, Kabin Malik. Before he became Muslim, he was considered to be one of the 5 greatest poets in Medina. He was also chastised by Muhammad for not participating in the Battle of Tabuk. Even Islamic sources mention Muhammad's admiration for poetry. without mentioning the name of the poet. It says in Sahih al-Bukhari 3906, narrated Urwa bin az-Zubayr, thus the Prophet recited a poem of some Muslim poet whose name is unknown to me. An illustration of just one of them and how Muhammad imitated their poetry. Consider Ibn Rawah. It says in a hadith that Muhammad frequently recited his poetry. For example, in Ash-Shama'il al-Muhammadiyah 240, when Aisha was once asked if Muhammad ever imitated poetry, she said he used to imitate the poetry of Ibn Rawah, and he would imitate his saying, "You will be brought to news." In Al-Adab al-Mufrad 867, Shurayh asked Aisha if Muhammad ever recited poetry. She said he used to recite some of the poetry of Abdullah Ibn Rawah. Same thing again in Tirmidhi. Aisha said Muhammad would say parables with the poetry of Ibn Rawah, saying, "News shall come to you from where you did not expect it." Muhammad recited poetry proudly, and they were described as verses, very much as the Quran is described. For example, in Sahih al-Bukhari 3034, narrated al-Bara, I saw Allah's Messenger on the day of the Battle of the Trench, carrying earth till the hair of his chest were covered with dust, and he was a hairy man. He was reciting the following verses of Abdullah ibn Rawah: O Allah, were it not for you, we would not have been guided, nor would we have given in charity, nor prayed. So bestow on us calmness, and when we meet the enemy, then make our feet firm. For indeed, yet, if they want to put us in affliction, we would not flee, but withstand them. The Prophet used to raise his voice while reciting these verses. Found in numerous Islamic sources, some of the links are below in the description box, of Muhammad asking Ibn Rawah how to compose a poem. Some Quranic verses were revealed, allowing some poets and their poetry acceptable. For example, it says in Tafsir al-Tabari, Hassan ibn Thabit, Ibn Rawah, and Ka'ab were crying when they heard Quran 26:224, and the poets, only the deviators, follow them. They complained to Muhammad, so verse 26:227 was revealed, except those who believe, do good, remember Allah often, and poetically avenge the believers after being wrongfully slandered. The wrongdoers will come to know what evil end they will meet. After this was revealed, they felt content. A shorter version of this account is also explained in Tafsir Ibn Abbas here. Many hadiths state there is good in poetry and how Muhammad and his companions would recite it to each other. All the sources are cited in Sunnah.com. For example, in Ash-Shama'il al-Muhammadiyah 246, Jabir ibn Samura said, I sat with the Prophet for more than 100 times, and his companions used to recite poetry to one another. They would also reminisce over things relating to the pagan era, while he was silent and sometimes even smiled with them. Muhammad said there was wisdom in poetry in Hadith 1940, Shawalillah. Indeed, in poetry there is wisdom, and in eloquence there is magic. In Sahih al-Bukhari 6145, narrated Ubay bin Ka'ab, Allah's Messenger said, some poetry contains wisdom. In these two hadiths, in the Arabic, it says min meaning from, not some as the English is translated. In Sunan Abu Dawud 5010, Ubay bin Ka'b reported the Prophet as saying, in poetry there is wisdom. Poetry and the claim to prophethood often went together in ancient Arabia. Muhammad was not the first to combine these two factors. For example, Umayyah ibn Abi Salt was a contemporary, and as a poet older than Muhammad, he also preached about the Abrahamic faith by way of poetry on subject matters such as the creation of the world, the angels, the deluge, the resurrection of man, and so on. Islamic traditions claim he wanted to be a prophet just as Muhammad was. However, Muhammad regarded him a deviant who led others astray, and did not accomplish his mission. There is an allusion to him in Quran 174-5. For example, in Asbab al-Nuzul it says, quote, "This verse was revealed about Umayyah bin Abi Asad, who had studied the scriptures and knew that Allah was about to send a messenger at around that time. Hoping to be himself that messenger, when Allah exalted is He sent Muhammad, Allah bless him and give him peace, he envied him resentfully and disbelieved in him." End quote. Despite this, Muhammad was the one who greatly admired him and learned poetry from Umayyah. It says in Sunan ibn Majah 3758, narrated Amr bin Sharid, that his father said, quote, "I recited 100 verses of the poetry of Umayyah bin Abu Salt to the Messenger of Allah, and after every line he said, more, and he said he nearly accepted Islam." There are many hadiths that confirm Muhammad's admiration for Umayyah's poetry. In Adab al-Mufrad 869, Sharid said, "The Prophet, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, asked me to recite the poetry of Umayyah bin Abi Salt, and I recited it. The Messenger of Allah, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, began to say, go on, until I had recited 100 lines. The Prophet said, if only he had become Muslim." In Al-Adab al-Mufrad 799, Sharid said, "The Prophet, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, rode with me behind him and said, 'Do you know any of the poetry of Umayyah bin Abi Salt?' 'Yes,' I replied, and recited a line. 'Go on,' he said, until I had recited 100 lines." In fact, Umayyah has a huge collection of poetry that can easily be related to the Quran because he preached a similar message to what later became the Quran. It was so good that Muhammad said this about him, quote, "His poetry believed, yet his heart did not." For more information about Umayyah and his works, please refer to the research conducted by Oxford University's N. Sinai and also to the research by Al-Makin from the State Islamic University in Indonesia. Another contemporary to Muhammad who used poetry to rouse and influence people was a figure by the name of Abbas ibn Mirdas. He converted to Islam in 628 AD and participated in the Battle of Hunain in 630 AD. Ibn Hisham in his Sirah, page 460 to page 70, mentions a story about an idol called Dimar that Abbas inherited from his father. The idol starts to speak about a prophet, which motivates Abbas to convert to Islam. In Diwan, page 110 to 112, Abbas claims to have led 1,000 warriors to Hunain with the influence of his poetry. As a result of his efforts, he demands more booty from Muhammad. At-Tabari in his Tariq, page 174 to 175, mentions Abbas's discontent with how much booty he was allotted. Muhammad responds to him with the words, "Let him shut up." Ibn al-Athir in his Kamil, page 183 to 184, gives a version of the booty conflict and cites Muhammad saying, "Go and make him shut up." So in conclusion, poetry and the Quran are interconnected and have a shared history. Pre-Islamic poetry is found verbatim in the Quran. Quranic poetry was considered just another form of poetry that was in vogue at the time. Early poets ridiculed the miracle claim of the Quran, all of whom Muhammad killed. Muhammad was fond of poetry. He recited it and surrounded himself with his own personal poets. There were many others, such as Umayyah and Abbas ibn Mirdas, who also claimed divinity through their own poetry or were able to influence people using poetry. Poetry was effective because it was able to rouse, provide inspiration, and was used as a propaganda tool, features common to the Quran.